Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I am here today with a very special guest, host of podcast Stella Speaks. We have Stella.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be on the channel.
Back at you, because in addition to Stella being a guest here on my channel in video form, I am also simultaneously a guest right now on Stella's podcast. This is a collaborative content endeavor. We're super excited about it. I've teased this on my Patreon, so some of you might already know. Stella and I have a little project going on that we're getting ready to start that we'd like to share with you our plans for. So my viewers know me, I'm Cara. Stella, if you'd like to introduce yourself first.
So I am Stella of Stella Speaks, which is truly terrible branding because some of you are thinking, Stella Speaks? The dog? No. So there's a dog that it's one of those dogs that can press the little buttons and you can teach your dog to kind of respond or push like a button that says treat or go outside. So I didn't know that when I started my podcast. So I just was like, Stella Speaks. But it's essentially what the whole project is. It started out as, I called it advanced bitchcraft. So the concept was kind of feminism and witchcraft. And for people who had read all of the 101 books and wanted to delve deeper without necessarily getting more complicated or choosing another system to study. And so kind of delving deeply into topics like gender essentialism, menstrual magic, immigration, just like all kinds of stuff depending on what was going on in the world and what kind of guests that I had on. And so you can find me on Podbean as my host, so Podbean, Spotify, Apple, and then a few things on YouTube. I'm kind of transitioning into having more of the stuff available there if people are interested. Since Stella Speaks already exists, all my socials are Stella Speaks Up. So if you want to find me on Insta and all of those, Stella Speaks Up, because the dog already has all the handles. Which should have been a clue to me when I was creating this whole thing that maybe I should have done an entirely different name. But I'm kind of stuck with it. I think I like it. If I ever do a rebrand, I'll let you all know. So that's basically the podcast and the format of it. I went through a bit of a change in this last year where I went to a seasons format. So in Aries season, I did a podcast with my new husband. We talked about basically our relationship and that like the
Because he's
witch
an
with the
Aries.
non-witch.
Because he's an Aries.
Yeah. So he's an Aries and I'm a Taurus. So we called it Mars and Venus. Has nothing to do with the Mars and Venus empire either. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. It has nothing to do with that. I promise. We stayed away from all that gender essentialism stuff. And then this Taurus season right now is a decluttering and cleansing season. And then we're moving into like a question and answer. So that's kind of what we've been doing now instead of doing long running series or doing just one off, is doing like a season format.
That's really cool.
It's fun because I think podcasting is so great because you get to have like a radio show that you just get to do whatever you want and wear sweats and pause and pet your cat. So I've really enjoyed my time with creating content in that way. It kind of started as a side project. The way that it evolved was really interesting. So I used to publish a zine called Cross Quarterly, which was an interfaith witchcraft zine. And so the concept was to have writers contribute from all over the world, which we did. And I did mail the zine out to Australia, I think was the furthest it ever got. But it was a very small zine. And a friend of mine and I were just always hustling for contributions. And so we decided to change it to a podcast format and have like panels. And then I decided I'm just going to make my own podcast. I'm sick of trying to like rope people in all the time for these kind of projects. And so the cool part of that is that when I just established it as me doing my own thing, then I've been able to have guests and collaborations like this that just are a lot more organic and feel a lot less forced.
Yeah, speaking of bringing people in for projects, I'm really grateful that you reached out for this because what we're doing, which we'll talk about in a bit, is something that I've wanted to do for a while, but it helps me to have structure and buddies to do it with. So I guess I should do a brief intro real quick for your
Please
audience, and
do.
then I would love to have you explain the project that you invited me to join you with. So, hi again, Cara. I am CuteWitch772 on YouTube and Instagram. I've been making videos on YouTube for over a decade, which in internet years makes me ancient. I've been on YouTube for a while. Primarily, I would call myself a vlogger. I do some topic-based things, but I've also in the past done daily vlogs. I used to work in community theater, so sometimes I was talking about community theater stuff. That's what my degree is in. So I have a theatrical background, musical theater background, and I did some family vlogs. There's some old videos with my grandma, who I love and miss very much. But primarily, I talk about modern paganism and witchcraft. It started as a way to just be able to reach out and meet other people who are interested in these topics, because I was a teenager spending a lot of time in my bedroom studying solitary witchcraft stuff. And over time, it evolved into informal teaching, like sort of sharing tips and tricks, and people on YouTube learning from each other's learned experiences, and this very cool kind of like collaborative learning through sharing thing. Like nobody was a formal teacher. We were just like sharing our respective studies. And then over time, I have become more of a formal teacher as well, which is really exciting. So I think people who have been watching my channel for a long time have witnessed that evolution of like, I'm not really speaking to you as a teacher. I'm just sharing my perspective, to now I'm still just sharing my perspective, but I also have some more formal teaching experience with this kind of stuff. I've done workshops for local pagan pride events, as well as traveled to be a guest speaker at other states in the United States pagan pride events. I went to Paganicon for the first time in 2022, did a couple workshops there, presentations, I would call them more. Stella and I both have some Unitarian Universalist background in common. That's something I still do from time to time. I'm a guest speaker speaking on pagan and witchcraft subjects, bringing that into interested UU congregations. So yeah, that's what I do. I talk about modern paganism and witchcraft, and I try to have as much fun as possible doing it. And what Stella and I have planned, I think, is very fun. So I want to get into.
I think it's going to be so much fun. Can I, before we go on to that, I just want to ask, what does the 772 mean? Does it mean something?
Oh, not really. Actually, this username was originally my AIM username when I was like 12. Now I'm 32, so we're talking 20 years of like actively, consciously being on the path of witchcraft and identifying myself as a witch. So I made that when I was 12, and cute remains to this point in my life still like the number one adjective that people use to describe me. So I really lean into that. But Cute Witch was taken. Of course it was. And so you know how they recommend like try this with some random numbers on the end. 772 was one of the suggestions. 7 is my favorite number. So that combination was just pre-suggested and resonated in a way that the others didn't. But then ever since then, it's just been easiest to like, whenever I'm making a new username, I know that the base one is going to be taken. So I always just put in 772 to keep the consistency. And it's always been available so far.
I think the numerology of it is still 7, isn't it? Because 7 plus 7 is 14. Yes. 14 plus 2 is 16. 1 plus 6 is 7. So then if that's your favorite number, then I think the numerology of it works.
Yeah, it's my favorite number. And then also later when I started learning about numerology, I realized it also happens to be my life path number. That's not why it's my favorite number, but those things are independently true and synchronistically connected.
Which one is the life path number? Is that when you add up the letters, or is that when you add up the dates?
Birth date.
The dates.
Yeah.
I don't remember what mine is. I know some witches who have kind of created their magical name with numerology in mind, but that was not my experience at all. Mine
Yeah.
was, I won't get into it because it's like a little on the sex, drugs, and rock and roll side about how my name was revealed to me. But yeah, mine was just revealed and it was like, it's Stella and that's it.
Yeah,
Which
I
is
have
funny
so
because I'm not a Stella, I'm a Blanche, obviously. Like if you were casting me, like you would not cast me as Stella, you would cast me as Blanche for sure in A Streetcar Named Desire. For sure.
I love it. Actually, that brings up another point that I forgot to mention earlier. Because Stella and I know each other through reclaiming communities, Stella actually knows me by a different name. I don't say what it is on my channel, so I go by Cara here, but Cara is my given name. When I started on YouTube, a lot of people assumed it was a magic name because a lot of people, Cara Mia, it's Italian, it means my beloved, and it's what Gomez calls Morticia in the Addams family. So a lot of people like it. So a lot of people thought that it was a magical community name. And I would say it happens to be my given name, but it is also a magical name. Like I feel very connected to that. But I do have a different name that I go by in reclaiming community. So if anybody is watching or listening who knows me through reclaiming, you know me by a different name, and that's okay. We all have multiple names. My magical name that I use in reclaiming community came to me during a ritual and also happens to fit the numerology, which was another way that I knew it was mine.
Yeah, I forget what Stella is. Mine is kind of witchy too. So my parents are kind of now kind of like conservative Catholics, but they're also kind of mystical. They're kind of mystics. And so the name, my given name is Cassandra, which is pretty freaking witchy. But they didn't know anything about Greek mythology when they chose that name. They literally just like looked at me when I was right when I was born, and they were like, "Oh, she doesn't look like an April or any of these other names they picked out." And they're like, she's not an April. She's, and they're like, she's a Cassie. And so then it was Cassandra, and that was it for forever. So sometimes I think maybe I should have kept it for witchiness because it is kind of witchy, but it's also very tragic. So I'm kind of glad it's not.
Yeah, we can all have many names.
I suppose. So let's reveal the project.
Yes. How do we want to do that? Drum roll.
We're showing books on the screen for the listeners. So, as a gift to our younger selves, we are going to be doing a series of activities from the Llewellyn smash hit published in 1995 to stir a magic with a K on the end cauldron, which is one of a series of 3 books that Silver Ravenwolf wrote in the mid to late 90s about witchcraft. It's a gift to my younger self. And I think that we had a similar, I mean, you're a bit younger than I am, but I think that if I was maybe just like 5 years ahead or older, in a similar kind of finding witchcraft as a young person. There's a little bit more pagan resources online when you were coming up, probably, but still not very good. Like random GeoCities websites and things like that. Like, and some forums, some of them very good and some of them kind of weird. So it's kind of a gift to our younger selves to do this project because for me, this is something that I would read about in my bedroom. Like, oh, someday I'll have this. Do you want to talk about your history with the book? Because I have a lot to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, let me maybe say a quick thing because I don't have as much to say. And then Stella's got a story, which I love. So I'm excited to read these now, like I said, 20 years into my practice because I did all of my book accumulation as a young witch primarily through the secondhand store. So what I was reading was often dictated by what other people were no longer reading and were reselling to shops. So I think it says something interesting that I never came across Silver Ravenwolf books in those stores. People who had them at the time were holding on to them. So I didn't get the chance to read these at that time in my practice, whereas a lot of people from what I would call my generation of witches. I do think Stella and I are in the same generation of witches as far as like the period in which we came into it and the stuff that was generally available. late 90s, early 2000s. I didn't come across these, but many other people in that generation may have started with these. And so I think there is a lot of stuff in here that pervades that section of community that maybe I wasn't super aware of at the time and only really heard about second or third hand. So, like Stella said, this is very much like a gift to our younger selves. For me, it's a chance to go back and play with, like, this is the stuff I could have been reading at the time. What might that have been like? And also, how do I get to look back at it now from the lens of my current life experience and knowledge? And what would I change with everything, right? What do we keep? What do we leave behind? What would I pass on? How would I update things if I was doing it now? And getting a chance to do something involved with this book with a buddy for accountability and also just like fun. So yeah, I have never read these books before. I didn't own them until recently. I just acquired secondhand copies of all three of them plus Teen Witch. And my copy of Cauldron is roll beat up, actually. She's seen better days, but
I love that. I have one book on my shelf that sometimes I think about weeding because it's so beat up, and it's way worse than that one. I think it's Positive Magic by Miriam Weinstein.
oh yeah.
It is, yeah, I got it from like a witch's estate after she died. She donated a bunch of stuff to a pagan festival. So I got it for pretty much nothing. Oh, it's worse. We might have to have a show and tell here.
The worst part of mine is the back section, like in the appendices. Somebody's dog must have gotten a hold of this book or something. But for the most part, I can still read all of the things. There's just a couple book titles on the reading list that I can't read, but I put some tape on one of the other pages, which I know some people are like, don't put tape on your page because it'll yellow over time, but like this book is yellowed, so what do I care?
I treat my book, the way I feel about it is like a monk did not copy this by hand in a leather bound tome, So for me,
True.
paperbacks, I own it, and so I'm gonna write in it and put my little comments and highlight it to hell and all of that.
I was gonna
So
say, are you an ink and highlighter person? Because I am a pencil marking person. I keep it to pencil in case I want to get rid of it, but that's me.
No, just like the crossword, just go right in with ink. And sometimes I put little sarcastic smart-ass comments on the sides, which is fun when people borrow my books. They're like, I enjoyed your commentary. I was like, my commentary? I was like, oh, did I leave a bunch of stuff where it's like, this is whatever, blah, 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 swear words on the sides. The part that we're actually doing is not the whole book, although we are reading the whole book, which I have read many times. So I had the flip side of your experience, which was that this was the first, not this particular copy, this is a different copy than the one I had, but To Stir a Magick Cauldron was the first witchcraft book that I personally own in my own collection. So,
wow.
Yeah, my friend, we must have been in 7th or 8th grade. My friend gave it to me for my birthday. I literally hid it between my mattress and my box spring and my little fluffy dust ruffle. And I would just stay in my room and read it. And I would have this experience. My friend also gave me a bundle of some sort of herb. It could have been sage back in the day. It was some sort of bundle of herb, which I was too scared to light. So I would just like smell it through the plastic and then read my book and just like be a witch inside of my head. And then when we had sleepovers, we would do like little spells before homecoming dances and stuff like that. So life is so wild because the person who gave me this book, I just saw in person when I was visiting back home in Omaha. I taught a class at Hearthside Candles and Curios, and she came to my class. It was about like the 4 elements, kind of. And I was like, it's my origin story right in front of me. How have you been? So that was really special to me. And I would read this book over and over. I practically have it memorized. And the thing that to me that was so powerful about it in comparison to most books I've read, and in compared to the other ones in her series, is that she tells a lot of stories about like little stories that happen with her witch friends. So you like meet her little witch friends in her coven by name, and she talks about, oh, this time we did a summer solstice ritual, and someone came and they were rude, and blah 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 blah. And it was like my biggest dream on planet Earth to be able to like have. I'm gonna cry to be able to like have witch friends like that. And now I have so many that I could write my own little book about. Oh, we did this ritual, and oh, we went on this trip to the woods, and oh, we stayed in a cabin, and blah 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 blah. And so yeah, like that part of it really manifested. But what I never did was this curriculum that she has in the back. And so that is what the project is in the back. If you have the book, it's in Conjuring Your Inner Self. Know the Craft Community circa 2000. We were like, woo, the millennium's coming. And there's a section on for me, it's page 256. I don't know. But maybe if you're reading it like digitally or a different edition, maybe. But yeah, you have the same cover, so it might be the same edition.
Yeah.
I had a different cover when I was a kid. And so on that page, there's this part that says goals to work toward. And then she has this little like, oh, let's pretend that you're going to join a tradition. If you were going to join a tradition, here's the curriculum that you might have for your first degree, your second degree, and your third degree. And so the concept is that we will do that curriculum. Like we're going to go through the first degree. Yeah, the first degree of the Mist tradition.
Mist tradition, M-I-S-T, which I love that. It's the first degree stuff, and also one thing from the second degree list. The Wicca 101 test is on the second degree list, but we really want to do that.
Yeah, I do want to do that. So there, later in one of the appendices, is this your section that's all chewed up by the dog?
No, this part is safe. The magical symbols appendix is where it starts getting loved.
Aww. I still use these magical symbols. I haven't really seen anywhere else other than here and then in Scott Cunningham, but I use this one still.
Scott. Yeah.
Me too. Scott Cunningham Living Wicca. This blessing one, I just talked about it on the podcast because in my cleansing, I was like, oh, and there's the symbol that I draw in my water and on my coffee.
I use that one probably most of all too. I love that. Like, yeah, that symbol has really stuck with me. That's cool. When I got my copy of this book and I flipped through it, one of the first things so I do this thing often when I get a new book. It's almost like bibliomancy related, but not exactly. I'm not so much looking for a message, but I do this thing where I'll like flip through a book and I'll ask it, show me the thing that I most need to know right now, like about the book, in order to kind of know like what kind of book is this? What would I get out of it? And I flipped to that part where it's talking about the different degree systems and giving kind of an idea of what you would have to do for each stage as an example, like knowing that it's different in every tradition. And that is something that for years throughout my own path, there was that time period where, okay, I've read some beginner books. I feel like I'm past that, but I don't know what the hell to do next. And that's actually when I went to the secondhand bookstore with the intention of finding something to help me figure out what to do next. And I found the other book with the purple cover that we're going to talk about in a bit here that's going to be part of this project. No spoilers, because it kind of talks about being an advanced practice thing. But realizing it's in here, I was like, that is what I wanted at the time. And I had no idea Silver had already done it. And people who had read this book had that already. And I was just like, so many people I was talking to on the internet in the 2000s were in this phase of being like, how do we know how much we know? Like, that's one of the biggest issues with being a solitary from my experience, was just like not having that structure of having the formal teacher or the fellow learners who could, you know, we've done this much, and so we know that much. Like, all I knew was what books I had read, but I didn't really know how much else there was to go. So yeah, I flipped to that page. I saw that. I was very excited to learn that it had existed since the mid 90s. It was already there, and I just hadn't interacted with it. So I'm very excited, because sometimes you need that little bit of structure, especially as a solitary, coming up with self-study curricula.
Yeah, I know that exact feeling of like, what do I do next? That frustration of reading a 101-ish, I don't know, a relatively introductory text about paganism or witchcraft, and you're like, yeah, you cast a circle, yeah, there's a god and a goddess. Oh, this is kind of different. Oh, yeah. And it's not that that's bad or that that's wrong, and it's good to have all these multiple perspectives. But when you're trying to figure out what to do and how to do it, it can sometimes be like, oh, okay, I don't know. And so having a practical structure of like, okay, these are the things you should actually know and be able to do is kind of nice
And
to have an
also, like,
idea.
if you're at this point, here's a suggestion of what to do next to go deeper into that. Like, even just that sometimes is all somebody needs, but not knowing where to get it from.
And there's also the experience of reading things and not implementing it. I've done that a ton with all kinds of different like hobbies and crafts and animal husbandry. Like right now, I'm very interested in goldfish. I don't know if I'll ever get goldfish, but I'm reading and watching all the things about them, right? But I've never had them and I don't have them, right? And so it's kind of analogous to what I was doing a little bit in my first few years of my witchy exploration, which was I was reading whatever I could get my hands on, which was basically this book, a few books that my dad had, which is a whole different story. He's not witchy, but he had a few. We had like a book about voodoo and some like Native American spirituality stuff, but then also a couple, maybe two books on Wicca. He's just a very curious person, learned how to have a big library, whatever. And so I read those a lot. And I read this book cover to cover over and over. And then when I was at my friends' houses, I would read what I could get my hands on. But I mean, I couldn't even really look stuff up on the internet. Like there was dial-up. What was like just like keep everybody from getting on the phone all night and have my parents see what I was doing. But
Yeah.
then when I started exploring, when I had a little bit more freedom, when I was living on my own, I did come into that. Like, what do I do next? What do I do next? And so I joined a tradition was my solution to that problem was just join the tradition and had a degree system. I would say the things that are in this the lists are similar to a lot of the homework assignments that I had. The group that I was in was very interested in astrology, alchemy, and like medieval grimoires. So there was a lot of kind of Solomonic ceremonial stuff that I had to learn that I wasn't really interested in. But otherwise, I mean, I think that this is not totally off base from my experience being in a degreed tiered type of a system. And then now exploring reclaiming, which is a non-hierarchical anarchic type of a system. There's a body of knowledge in that there are classes that people take. But I think some people who are in the community might feel sometimes that same thing of like, oh, I've done this class or I've done all the classes, but I still don't understand XYZ. But the beauty of when you're in a tradition of any kind is the experiential nature of that is you're able to go to someone and say, hey, I really don't understand a cone of power. Like I get everyone's talking about it. What actually is it? And then someone can do it and show it to you. I bring up that one specifically because a friend of mine who was in a tiered, well, she's in a new one. She was in one kind of a tiered tradition and she's now in another one. But in the interim, when she was kind of still looking around and searching in between these two experiences, she went to a Jason Mankey presentation at a festival about the cone of power and was like, why didn't anybody explain this to me? That was even within a tradition. So, I mean, these gaps in knowledge happen.
Yeah, I was going to say, I, within the last year, read Jason Mankey's Transformative Witchcraft because when I met him at Paganicon, I asked which of his books he would recommend because I am in this role a lot of the time of teaching and of speaking about these topics to the general public, the curious public, non-witches and pagans. And because, and this is relevant, I might have said this earlier, but I forgot, I do not have that shared experience with Stella, that I have never been part of a traditional lineage degree system, formalized coven structure. That part for me is all self-study, and then I've been in some other like informal type groups, but not initiatory lineaged things. So I asked Jason, he recommended that one, and one of the things that stuck out to me the most was the chapter talking about the cone of power, and he talks about how usually that is not taught in such an explicit way. It's like, well, you'll experience it at some point in a ritual. In reclaiming, it's very often used. So if you participate in reclaiming rituals in physical space, you probably come across it pretty early. But if you're just doing reading, or if we're doing things online, it isn't as easy to bring up. And so like with our local community, I know that early on I was like, yeah, so there's these things that we do, and like, but it's so different when you're like at a gathering with like 50 people in the tradition who all know how to do this thing, and like the energy is going to feel different because, you know, going to a public pagan pride event, the energy raising portion is a bit different than like in a reclaiming ritual, or even probably in an initiatory coven ritual where there's more established group energy. So yeah, people's experiences with even that type of thing can be widely varied, and not everything is talked about in the same way, or some things are hard to explain in writing. You have to experience them in some way to like get it, to get how it feels and like understand how it feels embodied.
I think it's kind of like a cookbook in the sense that, like, my grandma published, it's like self-published a cookbook before she died of all of her favorite recipes. And we all have the cookbook, right? Like everybody in our family does. But there's like secret wisdom that is not included in the cookbook that like my aunt, not my aunt, I'm sorry, my sister and my uncle, who are like because my grandma was one of those "what are you doing in my kitchen" kind of a cook. So she would get overwhelmed, and she had a lot of people she was cooking for, and she had a great system. So she would have like one designated helper, and everyone GTFO, right? And so my uncle and my sister, they have like some secret knowledge about, I know it says in the recipe book to use a cup, but when she says a cup, she actually means to measure with this like measuring can that she had. So if you're doing it at home, you need to make it like a little bit more, a little bit less. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So, yeah. I mean, that stuff can kind of happen. I think the important thing to note for me is like, one, most people are solitary. Like the vast majority of people are solitary. Maybe that's not true of authors. So a lot of times when you read books, especially the early stuff in the 60s and 70s, you're like, everybody's in the coven and I'm not cool because I'm not. Most people are not in a coven. Most covens don't last very long. Like we have this fantasy that they're like the Rolling Stones and they've been together for 50 years. It's not the case. It's like most rock bands. They change their name 5 times and then they fizzle out, and then 2 members start a rival band. Like it's just human doing human things. So I think I had a fantasy when I started that there was, I don't know, I don't think I ever really wanted to be in like a coven with degrees. I just wanted to have like witchy community. And then it was the knowledge gap that drew me to joining a degreed system. But it was really just chance. There happened to be a lineage degreed system in my town that they did public rituals, and I just kind of fell into it. There's good, there's bad, there's in between. So I would say, like, if anybody ever feels like they're not like a real witch or something because they're not in a coven,
hello.
no,
Yeah,
not a problem. That is not a problem.
Also,
and
even
then,
witches who are in covens also have solitary practices. Many times that is still very much expected. And not everybody gets that when they're seeking a coven as well. I think some friends of mine who are coven leaders have shared that sometimes seekers come in with an expectation that if they join a coven, that means that they're not going to have to do any work alone, that it's going to be all together. And it's like, no, there's definitely still stuff you're going to do on your own, and you have your personal practice. And so it's also not like some people think joining a coven means they have to give up their personal practice. Like, you could maintain a personal practice that is of an entirely different tradition sort of flavor than the coven you're working within. Like, that only applies to when you're working with the coven, you know? So I've lost track of how long we've actually been talking. But when we get into talking about the books that we've decided to use for like the book reading lessons bit of this, because we're not going with the ones that are recommended in the text. We've already read those ones. We'd like to challenge ourselves a little bit, and also for me re-explore something that I have already done but that is relevant to our tradition now, to reclaiming. There are things about this other book, about the other books that we're going to be using, that I think really lend themselves to that blend of whether you are working with a group or solitary, and also like what level you're at least with the one book.
Yeah. And there's another thing too about hierarchy that I'm really glad that I'm not a part of anymore. And I wouldn't really be in a hierarchical system again like that, because I'm trying to create a world that's non-hierarchical. But the one point that you did bring up about solitaries and having your own practice is like so true. I was in a very, I would say almost orthodox, right, type of tradition that was very like, we do things this way always, blah blah blah, you have to know this, you have to do it this way, scripted, memorized exactly this way, know the history, blah blah blah. Well, we all did whatever we wanted, truly, when you're on your own time, however, whatever you wanted to do in your personal practice. There was kind of an expectation that you would not go to other groups without permission, which was a thing that I didn't love. But yeah, your own practice is your own practice, because you're not living with these people. And I think that some of us have a fantasy too. Like, yeah, that's the other fantasy, is that we're all going to be living in these like communes with all of our witch friends, doing things together all the time. But kind of the reality is people are busy. Like in my dream world coven, right? We meet on the new moon, we meet on the full moon, we meet on all these seasonal festivals, we get together for each other's birthdays. That's like weekly. That's so much of your time. If you're trying to have a job, a family, mundane hobbies, like sometimes I have to remind myself, like, you like to do other things besides witchy things, right? So, you kind of have to have your solitary practice too, because you can't always like summon your coven either. Like, you're going through it, you get a phone call that your dad's in the hospital at midnight. Like, of course, you send it out in your little group chat or whatever, but if you want to do healing stuff, you're doing it on your own in the moment.
Yeah.
For sure.
So speaking of really ultimately doing whatever you want to do, we have decided on some ways that we are adjusting the first degree of mist tradition for us right now. So let's talk about that real quick.
In goals to work toward, number 4 says pass the testing of all your lessons. And then there's a handy dandy little footnote that says, remember, this is make-believe and anything is possible. Therefore, the lessons and exercises you are to complete are in To Ride a Silver Broomstick and Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft. I've read both of these books before. I haven't worked through every single exercise.
Yeah.
Which books did we pick? We had a bunch of options. We were like, I was very resistant to doing To Ride a Silver Broomstick because it's not my favorite of the 101 books, I will say. And then I was resistant to Buckland's Big Blue Book because it's so big. And I don't own a physical copy. I listened to it on audio. That's a lot of hours of audio, let me tell you.
And a lot of that book is like workbook. So you would also be probably listening to like the questions being read, like the journal prompts and stuff. Yeah.
And the tables, Cara, that's the part that's the worst, is just listening to this like dry British narrator say, the color red, passion, the color orange.
Yeah.
Like the herbal tables, all the correspondences. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, I
Not that it would
recently
be a good
listened.
book to work through.
Yeah, I have been working with the Big Blue Book for a little while now, in conjunction with working with Buckland's work more deeply, I'll just say. But I have recently moved. I'm staying with my mother, and I didn't bring all of my books with me. So I actually did not bring Big Blue. I brought a different Ray Buckland book, which I partly listened to on audio, and had those tables of correspondences. And I was like, well, I'll skip that part. I'll just skim that in the physical copy. So we had a discussion about, like, not just what books do I own, what books do I have with me, so that we can start this process now with what I have where I am. And the one book we picked, I do own a physical copy, but it is in Ohio and I am not. So I checked out whether I could get an ebook copy of it, and I do have access to it in ebook, so we could go forward with that. And that one is Stuart Farrer, What Witches Do, which is a book that neither of us have read. Is that correct?
That's
But I
true.
know.
Yeah, that's a gap. That's a big gap for me, is the Farrar's work. I haven't read any. I've read bits and pieces, but yeah, so that was on her reading list for the first degree or whatever. So I was like, then that'll be good. And I haven't read it.
Yeah,
So
and I
that'll be good. And then the other book, do you have a physical copy of another?
Yep, I have my other one with me. Da, 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 da. The 12 Wild Swans. My viewers of my channel will have heard me talk about this book before. This is a reclaiming tradition text. This is the purple covered book I was alluding to earlier that I found at the secondhand bookstore when I was looking for that, like, next step somewhere. I think something about it actually uses the word advanced. Yeah, the lessons set out in The Spiral Dance, the earlier book by Starhawk, are taken to a more profound level in this book, the first ever written to provide advanced magical training. Some of that is probably marketing, right? Like, we don't know that it's the first ever that goes beyond basics. But this was perfect for me at the time because it is set up as though you are reading along with the way that a reclaiming tradition witch camp might go. Witch camp being a week-long intensive where we do go to camp and live with a bunch of other witches for a week and do magical work. And there are different paths you can take during the day, and we can do, separate things, and then we all get together in the evenings. This book is written with 3 paths that you work through the same story of the 12 Wild Swans in levels. And it's the Elements path, which is a reclaiming core class. It's the first one, introductory. You learn about basics of reclaiming tradition, but also about foundational principles of magic and working with the elements. Then there is an inner path where you work through the story, doing a lot of inner work on yourself, self-work, reflection. Then there's an outer path that goes into connections with the community and working for your larger community or for the world at large. And so that's sort of like moving from the within to without. And it sort of generally is in a more or less beginner, intermediate, advanced type of format because each one builds on what you've done with the one previously. So this is exactly what I was looking for at the time, and also just happened to be something that got me further into reclaiming, because after I worked through this on my own, I did a little bit of communication with a friend of mine in reclaiming who actually lives in Australia. They then were coming to the United States and teaching an elements path at a camp. So they invited me to attend that camp, to meet them in person for the first time and do this thing. And that was really my introduction to being part of physical reclaiming community and like meeting people in person and being in reclaiming. That was 2015. So I've been involved in reclaiming since then, because of this book and the way that it's set up and how it really walks you through, like, here's what to do next and here's how to go further and how to go deeper. And I'm really excited to, so I have worked through this book before in its entirety on my own. And I'm excited to go over it again. And we are also planning going through it with our local community, but a path at a time and broken up over like months apart, like over the course of a year and a half.
So this was your origin story, your reclaiming origin story?
Kind of, yeah, because I had heard of Spiral Dance first through a couple of people I knew through the Pagan Perspective. I was co-founder and host and organizer of the Pagan Perspective collab channel on YouTube, which ran for like 13 years before I finally let it rest, let it be. Some people that I met through that really early on recommended Spiral Dance to me, and I found it at the secondhand bookstore, and I picked it up and I read it, and there was just something about it that kept telling me I wasn't ready yet. And like after I graduated from college, I went back and I picked up another copy of the book that was there, and that time I felt the okay, go ahead from the universe. So I worked through Spiral Dance on my own, and then that I think is why eventually when I went back looking for more advanced work and I saw that this was also by Starhawk and it was Reclaiming, I was like, oh, it's more of that. And then, yeah.
I had like a dream of Reclaiming, but I didn't find a community until, was it last year or the year before?
A couple of years ago now, I think.
Time doesn't, ever since 2020, time passes very differently for me than it ever had before.
Yeah.
And it's never really gotten back into its normal rhythm for me.
I believe it was in 2021 that most of the people that we currently have in our group like made the connection. Some of them originally reached out in 2020. I don't remember exactly when you reached out.
I was later. I know
because you and I met a year ago in person.
A year ago, yeah. And I don't think I was really like involved online for much longer than a few months before, probably. Yeah, because I moved here to Ohio during the pandemic. And so I really wasn't like going out and meeting a whole bunch of new people. Like I wasn't totally in lockdown once vaccines happened, but I was still very cautious. And I had just left a very difficult witchy group situation. So it took me a little while to be ready again, to date again in the witchy sense. But I read Spiral Dance probably in, I don't know, 2010 or 11 maybe. I just had dinner when I was back home with the person I remember vividly. We met at a Unitarian service, like a witchy service. And this person has kind of expanded their practice, but is pretty much like an Irish polytheist, somewhat Reconstructionist, revivalist, very much of that. And I'm much more on the loosey-goosey, soft polytheism Wicca type side. And so we would always have really interesting discussions, and I learned a lot from them. And I remember saying, do you remember the first time that we had coffee? And I like came and I gave you Spiral Dance, and I was like so like almost proselytizing. I'm like, I read, because we were both so into social justice issues. And I was like, I read this book. You have to read this book. And then you gave it back to me like it's literally just like Wicca again. Like I'm not interested. I do my polytheist thing. And but I was like hooked. I was like, this is it. Like this is what I've been looking for. My witchcraft had always influenced my feminism, and my feminism had always influenced my witchcraft, but never in a way that I could put words to. In the way that when I read the Spiral Dance, I was like, oh. Yeah. It was like when I went through a phase where I was reading everything that Bell Hooks had ever written. And I remember like the first time I read the phrase white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and it was like click. Oh, everything fell into place. That's the puzzle piece. Everything makes sense. I had a similar experience to when I read the Spiral Dance. I was like, oh, this is how witchcraft and activism can be together. I get it. And so I've read everything that Starhawk's ever written, except for the Empowerment Manual. I've only read the appendix. And I did go through the 12 Wild Swans, but only as a book club. I organized it at a Unitarian church. This is years after Spiral Dance. And I was like, oh, we should do a book club. And so my fantasy was that we were going to actually do the exercises. But it turned into just a book club where people just like read and talked about it. And that was also good and fine. But I haven't actually worked through all of it in order. Although I've taken the elements class, so in a way I've done a lot of these things. But there are a few things.
Yeah. There's some different exercises in there that like people may or may not have come across in other contexts. Yeah, for me, I do think that bit about like something telling me I wasn't ready for Spiral Dance pre or during college absolutely had to do with the fact that Reclaiming is based in social justice and activism, like was designed and began with those things being blended. At the time, I was not yet, this is going to sound really like whatever, but I was not yet awakened to that part of my reality. It wasn't until like during college that I started becoming cognizant of like, I already identified as queer, like bisexual, pansexual from high school, but it wasn't something that I had politicized. It's not something that I understood as being, to me, politics was like stuff that had nothing to do with me, that was like old white men in the history books that I could not wrap my head around from history class. So it just kind of took until something shifted for me through my friends that I met through college, to where I learned like the personal is political and the political is personal. And so once I embraced that, that's when it was like, I'm ready to engage with spiral dance now. I think before that point, I would have felt like, oh, well, I'm not really an activist, so this isn't really for me. Whereas now I'm like, yeah, this is for me. And I am for this because it helps me to be more of me for other people and for my community as well. Also, brief note about reclaiming history, because it does have roots with Wicca. Like a lot of the people who started the reclaiming tradition or were members of the original collective that later evolved into the tradition, they were taking Wicca classes. They were doing Wicca stuff because Wicca is what was there for people to learn from. Spiral Dance was published on Halloween of 1979, same day as Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon, two separate coasts, California and New York, two very influential books, same day. Holy crap. What a historical day for witchcraft in the United States and beyond, I would say, but definitely here. So now, because there are Wiccan roots, there's definitely a clear, like Wiccans will recognize stuff in spiral dance. I know some Wiccan groups who use spiral dance, but over time, the evolution of the tradition, being its own thing, being non-hierarchical, blah, 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 reclaiming is not considered a Wiccan tradition. Although there might be people who identify as Wiccans who are part of reclaiming and vice versa, and there is a similar foundation. We have similar roots. But like, I came across some people who thought that by getting involved in reclaiming, that meant being initiated into a Wiccan tradition. And it's like, not exactly. They are different entities. Reclaiming also has deep roots with the Anderson fairy tradition taught by Victor and Cora Anderson, who were also influenced by the popular Wicca stuff of the time, but also by so many other things. And so, like, a lot of the tools we work with in reclaiming, the other core classes are using tools that directly come from the Andersons and the fairy tradition of witchcraft. So, reclaiming tradition of witchcraft, not specifically Wicca, but they're not totally separate, but they're not totally the same.
Yeah, that's such a thing. I was just having coffee with some birders because I do birding, you know. And so we were having coffee after we went and looked at the birds through the binoculars. And they're just getting to know me and whatever. And they're Unitarians. So I'm, just being my whole full self because why not? And they asked me, one of them asked, like, are you a Wiccan? And I was like, woof. I'm like, I don't think you are ready for this conversation. Like, so I'm like, sort of, and I just move on. Like, I don't know what you think that means. And I know what I have experienced, which I'm like, well, sure, I was initiated, so I guess I am, but I don't really practice in that same way all the time. Just like I was initiated into the International Thespian Society as a kid, and am I a thespian? I was in the Spanish Honors Society in college. Does that mean anything now that I took that initiation? I don't know. The tradition is so similar. Like when you get down to like brass tacks of like ritual mechanics, I'm like, this is very similar.
Yeah. There is a thing that is basically like a Wiccan ritual structure / format. Reclaiming definitely follows that. It's very familiar to most pagans in the United States, maybe also elsewhere, but I'm only speaking for here with my experience. There are a lot of people who are like, my practice has nothing to do with Wicca, but when you look at how they do their ritual, the way they structure ritual came directly from traditional Wicca. So for me, not being initiated into specifically a Wiccan tradition, I usually will say something like, my path is absolutely heavily influenced by Wiccan practitioners and the public info that they shared, such as Ray Buckland, Scott Cunningham, Silver Ravenwolf, and more. But I do not consider myself a Wiccan specifically because I haven't been initiated into a Wiccan tradition. So I identify as a pagan witch. I'll get more specific with terms with people who can, we can have that nuanced conversation. But yeah, it's so hard to what you said is perfect in the sense of like, I don't know what you think that means. Therefore, I can't really speak to it until I know what it means to you, or without giving this long disclaimer about what it means to me.
Yes, I think that's probably a good way to say it, So I don't know what you mean by I don't know what you mean by Wicca. They specifically were like, oh, we went to this like drag queen protest thing, and there were religious people who were speaking about how like drag is like totally fine and sacred and whatever. And one of the people who spoke happened to call themselves a Wiccan priestess and was the best speaker according to this couple. And so I was like, oh, you're trying to see, are you like this person or something?
Yeah.
I don't know. No, I don't know.
Right. Like maybe in some ways, maybe not in others.
Yeah.
That's true for Wiccans too, though, right? Like, yeah.
Woof. And a lot of gatekeeping there too, of like, if you're not in this one or that one, you're really not Wiccan anyway, because you don't have special sauce, because you didn't get the special initiation sauce.
Yeah, it's a
So
lot.
I'm really looking forward to this project. What do you want to get out of it? Have you thought of it in that way?
So, I mean, kind of bouncing back to what we were saying earlier about like, I'm excited to read this for the first time. And like that moment that some people get to where we're like, I've read the Wicca 101 books. I'm like, okay, there's some good stuff in here, but it's mostly like been there, done that. There was a period for me where I stopped reading a bunch of these books because I was like, I don't need that personally. And so I want to do other things personally. And I think that's when I was getting into reclaiming, which was like going deeper into a new aspect for me. And I do divination. I do other types of things like that. I'm currently learning some new divination systems, going back and like trying to strengthen my skills in others. Like I was doing a lot of stuff like that for a while and not reading books because there weren't any books I was coming across that weren't feeling like the same thing. I didn't start going back and reading stuff like this until I came into this place of like, well, now I am a teacher in some ways. And so I want to go back and see when I come across a person who has questions, I need some more context about what information they already have. So now one thing that I want to get out of it in that aspect of myself is like, now when I meet people who I know have read these things, it will help me to contextualize more of where they're coming from because I've had now the firsthand experience with what they were reading and experiencing and maybe accepting as the way things are. And then on a personal level, it's that like younger self, which is a term that we get from reclaiming and fairy, but like child self, etc. My 20th witch anniversary was this year. And so I've been doing a lot of reflecting about like that 12-year-old version of me and what they were up to and what they thought might happen. So on a personal level, it's very much that. On the wider community level, it's like I'm wanting to gain some context and like I'm very interested in like the history. I'm always saying books are time capsules. So like going back and seeing what is this snapshot of the Wiccan witchcraft community, the neo-pagan community in this time period, in this place, through the lens of this person, Silver Ravenwolf. Yeah, engaging with all of the stuff around the entity that sort of has become Silver Ravenwolf in the public community mind.
Yeah, a somewhat controversial figure in some ways, I guess. More in perception than I think any kind of action. So I think that, yeah, that's something that's interesting to delve into. I think for me, I just wanted to do something that was kind of like a little discipline, a little structure. And so, and
Mm.
having someone to bounce the ideas off of. I love classes. I love book clubs. I love study groups and all of those like collaborative ways of learning. And so I thought, I think maybe a seed had been planted. We had been chit-chatting about something. And I remember us talking about maybe doing something with Silver Ravenwolf. And then I was like, oh, it should be this. So you're like, yeah, we talked about that. I'm like, oh, that must have been what it was that we talked about. And so
Yeah.
I'm excited. A lot of this first degree stuff seems to be about memorizing things, which will be good for me, I think, to have a few. And then passing the testing of our lessons. So we'll read the 2 books. I'm very excited for the Meet a Challenge designed especially for you portion.
Yes. That's something else that we are doing, and I think in a way that is heavily influenced by reclaiming. In 12 Wild Swans, it talks about, so there is an initiation in reclaiming, but it is a non-initiatory tradition. What that means is there's a thing that exists that is like a rite of passage you can do that's called initiation, but it's not required for being part of the tradition or engaging with the community in any way. It's totally optional. And so in the book, it talks about how when that happens, it's done by not just one initiator or 2 initiators, but like a panel of people among your teachers, among your community, who you invite to be your initiators, and they agree. So it's all consensual, and there's a lot of negotiation, and there will be challenges set that are personal. And the way the book talks about it, it says like they should be things that the person issuing the challenge either has done themselves or is able and willing to do. So like I can't challenge Stella to like climb to the top of a really high mountain and like bungee jump off of it if I myself wouldn't be willing to do that myself. You know, if I'm not willing to do it, I can't challenge you to do it. So I think we're going to be going with that guideline. I think is cool. And after I read this book, 12 Wild Swans, myself, I asked some of my online friends for initiatory style challenges along those lines. And I haven't completed all of them, but it's something that I think has been really interesting and ongoing throughout my path. So I think that'll be very fun. We also talked a bit about the like having circle castings memorized and having quarter calls memorized, because reclaiming is very improvisational and organic. And so we usually just like, there are some set formats that you can pull from, but usually it's off the cuff. So I was like, we need to come up with some parameters for this. What do we want to do? And Stella said they really felt like Silver's intention was to have people study and memorize and be able to perform something basically from a script. So that's what we're going to be going with, looking up ones that already exist in other books, maybe that we don't already know or whatever. But that was a conversation we had too. Like, what does even that look like? The tradition we primarily engage with doesn't do it that way. So this will be an interesting intellectual challenge.
Yeah, definitely.
And not everybody can memorize stuff too, so that's tough for some people.
Yeah, that's really hard for some people, especially to know that like 3 different kinds of circle casting, 3 different kinds of quarter calls. Like in the tradition that I was in, there was pretty much just the one. Well, we just used it every time. So it's just kind of interesting to come up with multiple. Yeah. So I think it'll be fun. I might write some of them, but I think I might just find some of them too. I'm giving myself a little freedom.
Demonstrating a solitary ritual that includes raising power. Actually, I'm realizing now it doesn't say that you have to write it. It just says you have to demonstrate a solitary ritual that includes raising power. But I think we've decided to create one. So
well, I guess we don't have to write it if we don't want to. But I have a couple that I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
So
providing a magical diary to your instructor that goes over your experiences for 1 year. we've decided to do that for like the 12 weeks that we're going to be doing this. Try to make some notes of things daily and share them with each other. And we might be sharing them publicly on our respective Patreons, blogs, etc. There's a couple things here that we are going to do when we see each other in person this summer. Some things that are like demonstrate this skill to one another so we can like witness one another in, okay, like checking off that box, you've done that thing. Being willing to take the oath of initiation and all it includes. We're not taking an oath of initiation, so we were just going to excuse ourselves from that, but I kind of like the idea of coming up with some sort of statement of completion, and that will be something that we share publicly with our audiences as well, like wrapping it up at the end and being like, we hereby affirm that we have done this work together, we've witnessed each other doing that work, and yay, look at what we've learned.
Like a rite of passage, like a minor rite of passage. Yeah, because
I think that's nice too. That's something that solitaries don't get a lot, that can feel really nice to be like. One of my UU minister friends over the years had described it as being like having the teacher healer priestess certificate. Like he said, like one of the main differences between him as a UU minister, other than like having gone through divinity school and getting that very formalized recognition of what he's learned, the primary difference is that like written recognition that we have that experience and knowledge. So yeah, he called it the teacher healer priest certificate. I've changed that to teacher healer priestess or priestess over the years, but I still have that sort of image in my head. So that's what that is to me, is like this is our little like certificate of completion.
You did this. This was a thing that you did. You finished it. All right. So I think to wrap up, I want to draw a tarot card.
Okay, cool.
I think just a generic kind of, for me, I'm going to ask, what advice, oh universe, do you have for me as I embark upon this study in the made-up mist tradition? I have my card, but I haven't looked at it yet.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting one. I'm doing. Ooh, I like the back of that card.
Isn't it great? Oh, I just looked. Oh, it's a good one.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make you spoil it for yourself. I have the Sacred Creators Oracle because it's a message deck. It's got just like words on the cards, but it specifically is about like creative endeavors. So I'm pulling one for just like, what do we need to keep in mind as we embark on this creative project? Because it very much is. I've also not looked yet.
Okay, well, I accidentally looked, but we'll pretend I didn't. 1, 2, 3, shoot. So mine is the High Priestess with a crescent moon on it. Yeah.
Okay, High Priestess and nourish the sacred feminine.
Okay, all right.
I mean, okay, we don't do the gender essentialism, but there's something about this piece and the High Priestess archetype that, like, there's a crescent moon on it. We pulled the same card, basically.
We pulled the same card, basically. And although we might not fully identify with, like, the culturally
goddess tradition.
Yeah. And we kind of had talked about, too, that some of, which we won't get into right now, it's too much, but some of the criticism directed at Silver we think is kind of steeped in sexism. So I think that there's something to this with that, too.
Yeah, we could do a whole separate conversation about that throughout this process.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. So I'm reading the keywords in the book: deep introspection, planting the seeds, listening for the subtle signs that are all around you, look directly into the shadows at any lingering wounds that may continue to affect your understanding, and don't strain to see that which you cannot see right now. Instead, focus on your inner knowing and on what you can see. So this is very much, it's like a combination of the High Priestess and the moon if we were to apply this to like tarot.
Mm-hmm.
I think. Yeah, it also happens to be card numbered 18, which is the number of the moon in tarot systems. So, and the little prompt questions at the end of this cards section are: what does sacred feminine mean to you? Do you have other ways of naming this energy? How do you nourish this receptive, intuitive state? And do you tend to favor strategy or intuition, and how do you decide? That is literally something that we're straddling, as we were just talking about with like deciding how we were going to approach this. So we talked about a lot of things there. We jumped around a little bit, such as the nature of the conversation. If anyone has questions, there are comment sections available. We can try to clarify some things. But on our respective Patreons/blogs, other places that you find us on the internet, we'll be sharing more about when you can expect another check-in from us. We're going to be doing this over the course of about 12 weeks. And actually 6 weeks in, we will be together in person at camp. So we're providing a little bit of grace period for ourselves there, because we will be heavily engaged in some other very immersive work at the same time. So, and we also both have ADHD. So like we have a structure because the structure helps, but also that structure might shift. It might change. We might flow with that intuitiveness and mystery at some point. And so we'll keep you appraised of anything that dramatically shifts. But basically, we're going to be going through these things and reading some books together and doing some stuff over the next few months. And it's going to be really fun. And if you happen to have this book and want to do it too, and if you want to share what you're doing with stuff, that could be a fun way to engage. And we'll do sort of like, we're planning like a midterm check-in, and then also at the end. So midway will be like mid-July. And then the final wrap up, this would finish up around right at the end of August, 2023.
Yeah, if you're listening to this in the future and it's already happened.
Hopefully there is a lot of really fun, awesome content.
Yeah.
Let's pass our minds forward a few months to those people and that place and say thank you in advance for the journey that is about to come.
And so it is.
Blessed be. All right, so that's all we have for you at the moment. Thank you very much for watching and or listening to this video or the podcast version. Thank you very much, Stella, for joining us here and putting this together.
Me. Thank you for being with me, too.
I will see you next time here on my channel. Until then, don't forget to be awesome. Blessed be. Goodbye. Yeah.
The end.